final afternoon edition of the Visiting Writer Series. We're very pleased to welcome Amer for the final event in this spring's mini series. There are many other literary events upcoming, so I want to mention those before I introduce Adam. So tomorrow afternoon at 1:30 in the Campbell Student Union Theater, President Swallow and Adam Ross will be discussing historical hybrid novel, and there will also be I think Emily and somebody and another student are also going to be involved in the panel with the other student.
Bradley.
And Bradley. And then the audience can also be a point where people can be involved. So hope to see you tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. And also over the next week is Shakespeare's birthday week. So please come and see the English Players production of Twelfth Night at 4:30 on Tuesday, featuring many fine actors in the room today, in the front row, the back row, the side row, and at the podium. And then on Thursday, April 26th, there'll be the annual Shakespeare Sonnet Festival. Again, many readers in the room. We're happy to welcome. The real inauguration is the reading of Shakespeare's sonnet on Thursday, so you don't want to miss that next Thursday. And that will be in the Student Union by the fireplace, and relaxed and elegant surroundings. And then finally, one last event I'll mention is May 15th at 6 p.m. in Woe's Place. The senior creative writers will present their chapbooks in a reading and celebration, so hope to see you there. I'm very happy to welcome Adam Ross, and I understand we're going to hear from a new novel that's in progress, which is very exciting news. Child actor. I won't spoil any more because I don't know. It's nice to be surprised. He is the author of Mr. Peanut, which was a 2010 New York Times notable book, also named the best book of the year by many publications, including The New Yorker, The New Republic, and so on. A very acclaimed book published in 16 countries. He's also the author of the short story collection Ladies and Gentlemen, Child Real Performance, apparently, I think. And his story, In the Basement, was a finalist for the 2012 BBC International Story Award. And he's a well-traveled person, was the Hod der Fel at Princeton and the Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow in Fiction at the American Academy in Berlin in 2014. He's currently the editor of the Sewa Review at the University of the South, which is why we're lucky enough to have him here this weekend as part of the celebration of the inauguration of President Swallow. And so we're happy to be able to jump on that train, and Adam was kind enough to agree to read his work and then also discuss a little and answer some questions about what it means to be the editor of one of the country's leading literary journals going back to the 19th century. Very exciting. Please welcome Adam Ross.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Before I start, experience dictates the following, which is, does everyone have their cell phones off? Would everyone like to make sure? And then, would someone mind closing that door in the back? If I had a mic, I would not mind it, but I'm really honored to be here, wearing, I guess, several hats. I'm honored to be here, first of all, to help celebrate the inauguration of John Swallow, who I consider a dear friend, who gave me a job that really changed my life in unexpected ways, and to whom I would just assure the English department is one of the straightest shooters and best bosses I have ever had. And I've had a lot of bosses, and which is what happens unless you're really, really fortunate as a writer. I've been very fortunate as a writer. It just took a while. So I encourage both faculty and students alike to always darken his door, because he is somebody who remains a guide to me in decisions I make, and I miss him terribly at Sewanee. I'm also here as a novelist, so thank you to the English department for having me. It's always an honor just to appear anywhere. It's more exciting for me to just be able to read new work. I've been working on this novel now for 5+ years. I sold it to my publisher, Knopf, 5 years ago, and they gave me a 2-year contract. So, sucker on them. But I guess that's how the cookie crumbles in publishing. Anyway, I am kind of streaking forward and hope to be finished with a draft by the end of this year, which is exciting. And I actually try to, in public, tell as many people as that to hold myself accountable. So if you see me in a year, be like, how's it going? I'll talk about that novel briefly in a second, but also I'm here to just answer some questions. We can talk about what I read, but I think I've done a lot of things in the run-up to being a full-time writer, because there was a period of time, a good 8 years before I took over at the Review, when I was a full-time writer. I was very fortunate to be able not only to write something successful enough, but also then string together some really lovely fellowships to continue to write for several years, and then sort of went back to my kind of bifurcated role as both a literary citizen and as somebody who's in the meantime writing. So I'd love to answer questions afterward, either by way of talking about what it's like to run a literary magazine, or even what it's like to have a literary life, like what that entails, because it's a very much crab moving sideways by hook or by crook life, and but all you need to do is really want to have it, and you can. I'm going to, I had all these different selections of things to read. But I thought what I'd do is drop in on the most sort of dramatic and traumatic scene in the novel. It'll be a solid 15+ minute reading, maybe a little longer. The novel is called Playworld, and the way I like to describe it is it's about a really bad year in the life of a child actor. It takes place primarily in 1980 and 1981, although it's framed by events in 1999 in Nashville and New York City, right before the dot-com bubble bursts. It's a novel in 3 acts. And I'm going to read a section where you learn how Griffin, the main character, became an actor. And so when these events transpire, he's very young. He's about 6 years old, and it's in the early 70s. And this is like the origin story. Like, this is the Peter Parker getting bitten by a spider story. All right. So everyone can hear me okay? I'll just jump in the middle. It needs no setup. My initial memories of that terrible event follow a very clear sequence. It was a Saturday evening, the only day of the week my father was home. He'd been touring with the Fisher King then, the first Abe Fountain musical in which he'd performed, the one about King Arthur. After the Sunday matinee, he caught the train from Philadelphia or D.C. only to depart the following evening. The house is dark on Monday, he'd explain, as if the theater were his home and the cast his family. Our parents were in their bedroom when Orrin, that's his brother, his younger brother, and I snuck out of ours. On the living room's coffee table, beside an empty wine glass, were several lit candles my mother had left out. I took the holder by its knob and, stretching it before me like Ebenezer Scrooge, led Orrin into our front hall closet, a cave, I told him upon entering. The jackets above us stalactites. I was mad for games of pretend. When I raised the candle to illuminate these clothes, it detonated some dry cleaning's plastic. At least it sounded like an explosion, since the fire consumed it so fast it popped, instantly igniting the coat beneath it, the jacket as wondrously visible amidst the flames as Moses' burning bush. We ran to our room and hid behind the bed. "It's a fire," I told Orrin, "a real fire." When we couldn't stand it any longer, we hurried to alert our parents, who at first tried to calm us, but suddenly smelling smoke, did something remarkable because never before seen. They ran. At this point, my recollections grow jumbled. I saw my mother near the foyer, separated from me by a wall of flames. "Shell," she screamed to my father, "get the pail." I was sure she meant the plastic bucket that I took to the beach, the orange one with the white handle and my name written on it in black marker. But suddenly we were fleeing the apartment. I was borne aloft, my father yanking my wrist above my head and carrying me in such a fashion that I occasionally touched down, moonwalking. My foot stamped a patch of flame on the entryway rug, but didn't burn. We were in the lobby next. Some significant period of time had passed, for now it was filled with the evacuated tenants, all of us watching the firemen unhurriedly file in and march up the stairs, wearing oxygen tanks and lugging hoses or carrying axes, while the smoke crawled along the ceiling's recessed lights. I was in my father's arms. He was wearing his bathrobe, the one with the brown and black stripes, his only article of clothing to survive the blaze. All I could think while I held his neck was, me. I did this. But I don't want to mischaracterize this event. It certainly wasn't a tragedy, a 5-alarm fire in which no one was seriously hurt, though our cat died from smoke inhalation. Not that I, at the tender age of 6, cared much about the cat. We did lose a great deal of property, clothing, furniture, jewelry, the paintings by several artist friends that my father never failed to remind me might have become valuable one day. Not that I was old enough to be permanently attached to anything material. As for any trauma I suffered, that came a week later. This involved my parents' insurance company, a saga that pointed to several important discrepancies, more like blank spots, between the memories I've described and my mother and father's version of events. Apparently, Orrin and I didn't rush to tell our parents about the blaze. They smelled the smoke first and found us hiding in our room, then deposited us in the bathtub, running the water while they tried to put out the fire. And while I can't believe I don't remember this comparatively calm, incongruous pause in that conflagration, the fact is that I don't. My mother filled pots in the kitchen and, racing between the sink and entryway like a pioneer woman, futilely tried to douse the flames. My father, meanwhile, rushed to the stairwell. Giant fire extinguishers were installed on each landing, but when he returned to the apartment with the tank and twisted its handle to engage it, the hose sputtered uselessly, foam dribbling from its nozzle as if it were an empty can of shaving cream. The blaze was out of control by then, and conceding defeat, my father raced downstairs. All of this is much less interesting than what happened afterward. Al and Neil, this is the people they're living with after the fire, were kind enough to let us move into their place. My parents had a $10,000 insurance policy and filed the claim. Ironically, the agent handling it was named Nick Salvatore. My parents met him in the lobby for the apartment's inspection. This young man memorable for many reasons, but to my mother because of his heart-stopping good looks. He had all the classic traits of beautiful Italian men, from his curly, squid ink-colored hair to the amber-buttered hue of his skin, which made his teeth appear whiter when he smiled. His clothes, too, were perfect. He wore a camel hair coat over his black suit, a white shirt and dark tie, funereal colors, my mother thought, entirely appropriate given what had befallen them, but with beacon bright accents, the shirt and overcoat, for he was here to help after all. What made her swoon, however, were his hands, which she shook when they greeted. Something about their size and squareness, the hard angles of his thumb's metacarpal bone and the pronounced indented triangle where it joined the wrist made her desire take flight and then burst inside her chest like fireworks. She was a deeply loyal person, incapable of infidelity, and yet it took all of her self-control not to turn to my father and say, "Why don't you go find something else to do?" Salvatore couldn't have been older than 25, and while my parents rode the elevator with him to their devastated apartment, she was transported back to Rome, to their honeymoon. The afternoons she had to herself after the movie star Anthony Quinn, who had brought them along to Europe so my father could continue as his voice coach, had decamped with Shell to play tennis, a daily ritual that always ended with the pair eating lunch so late it pushed back dinner until nearly midnight. Come midday, when boredom and exhaustion had overwhelmed her, she fled their stuffy hotel room, abandoning her typewriter and Quinn's rambling, recorded dictation. She was transcribing his autobiography, to find somewhere to eat first and then window shop a little, killing the rest of the afternoon at a cafe with a book and a carafe of wine. This was followed by an early evening siesta that left her bright-eyed for the endless dinners which she was bathed and dressed for long before Shell and Quinn returned. During these several hours' jaunts through Trastevere or Prati, Foro Romano or Via del Corso, she was often accosted by such similarly gorgeous men walking Rome's streets singly or in packs, their English poor but for the most obvious blandishments, "pretty lady," or "my beauty." It was at these moments that she suffered neither temptation to stray nor regret at her newly betrothed state, but something far sharper and more crushing because it was an emotion entirely new to her. She felt alone in her marriage. Standing there in the lobby, my father also had a strong reaction to Salvatore's appearance. Why, he thought, were such movie star good looks wasted on an insurance salesman? Why couldn't he have been so similarly blessed? Not with those WAP features, obviously. They only got you bit parts in gangland flicks as one of the trench-coated, fedora-wearing, Tommy gun-carrying foot soldiers. But instead of his own enormous Easter Island face, from chin to crown as long as a canoe, with a brow so tall it made him appear as anvil-headed as Herman Munster. "You remind me," said one asshole casting agent, "of a Jewish Fred Gwynn." Why couldn't he have been gifted with a mug more symmetrical, proportional, classically American? To Lily, Salvatore said, "Mrs. Hurt, I'm sorry for your loss, but I promise, Nationwide is on your side. We're going to take care of your family." My father had immediately noticed Lily's reaction to Salvatore, her already severe shyness so intensified by his presence that she was rendered speechless. Her attraction to him was so obvious, an obviousness so closely akin to a poor performance that my father couldn't bear to watch. Unfortunately, this shift in his attention made him suddenly aware of the tenants coming to and fro, all of whom shot him looks at once accusatory and pitying, incriminating glances that made him wince inwardly. There they were, he imagined them thinking, the pyromaniac's parents. Surprisingly, Lily grew talkative the moment they got on the elevator, and by the time they arrived at the apartment's door, she not only recounted to Salvatore the whole disaster, but also confessed to a lingering sense of guilt for leaving out the candles. "I don't know how I could have been so thoughtless," she said. Salvatore pressed his hand to her shoulder, and although he rubbed it hurriedly like he might his homely aunts, so far as Shell was concerned, he rested it there a little too long upon stopping. "Oh, come on, Mrs. Hurt," he said. "You're being too hard on yourself already." "What if one of the children had been hurt," she said, "or worse?" Lily was crying now, and Shell was relieved, becalmed, confident. Her beauty was imperious, what with her swan's neck and bright cat eyes. Upset, however, her features collapsed like a shrunken apple's. The transformation seemed to cool Salvatore down. Thankfully, neither of them was, he noted. I rushed the kids to bed, she continued, all awash. I left dishes in the sink and those stupid candles on the table. Shell had been gone all week, and I wanted us to have some time alone. What was she going to tell him next? My father wondered. That while they were making love and heard the kids scurrying around, he told her to ignore them? That sooner or later they'd go to sleep? Let's let the man do his job, my father said. Her expression grim, my mother nodded toward the apartment's door. I don't think I can bring myself to go in there, she said. There's no need whatsoever, the agent said. Gathering herself, she offered her hand to him once more. Thank you again, Mr. Salvatore. Please, he said, call me Nick. At this, Lily smiled, then snapped open her purse and found some tissues, dabbing her eyes with them. She laughed, and the transformation back to her old self was miraculous, her face reconfiguring, her cheeks blooming with color. Salvatore smiled back like an infant mimicking his mom's moon features. I have to go see about an apartment for us uptown, she said. Salvatore waited until her elevator arrived. The moment after its doors closed, his face darkened. Let's take a look at this place already, he said to my father. The agent's bad mood persisted throughout the apartment's inspection, which to Shell seemed perfunctory at best, infuriatingly quick, one of those things a plumber might do upon entering a flooding room, tighten a plug to stop the rushing water's flow, and then charge you $100 for the moment's work. Salvatore seemed put out by having to breathe the smoke damage's overpowering odor, which he further underscored by pinching the tarred clothes and soot-covered bed linens, and then holding up his index finger in disgust, so that his pitch-black pad was like a failed white glove inspection, a sign of messiness instead of ruin. When they were back in the hallway, Salvatore finally spoke. Just so I've got this straight. Your kid sets the closet on fire, and then your wife tries to put it out while you get the building's extinguisher. But it doesn't work, right? That's right. Did you keep it? What? The fucking defective, probably never in a million years inspected fire extinguisher. No, of course not. Salvatore shook his head miserably. I bet you all the money I've got, he continued, that the superintendent's been racing up and down these stairs, checking every last fire extinguisher the second after your kid torched the place. Enough about my son, Shell said. It was an accident. Salvatore rolled his eyes. Tell me why you're not taking these guys to court again, he asked. You're looking at a hell of a lawsuit. But my father shook his head. We have insurance, he managed to say. He'd never considered bringing a negligence claim. For one, he distrusted the process, the lawyers, and the courtroom drama. What if it were all for naught? It was like multiple callbacks for an audition that ended with a producer's rejection. Getting one's hopes up hurt more than the final refusal. This was coupled with his own reluctance to cause a stir, consistent with his actor's disposition, a common flaw in that breed's character, but one my father suffered from acutely, for he saw such relationships as personal, based on more than simply commerce. Sue management successfully, and by recouping his losses, he risked inviting that state of relations most anathema to him. He would be disliked. So what now, my father asked. Salvatore shrugged. We got problems. How's that? Perhaps because they were standing in the hallway, Salvatore lowered his voice. Put yourself in my position, he said. I got a client whose kid ignites some combustibles, and now he wants to give me the full amount of his policy? No offense, but it's as if your dog bit me, and I'm the one being asked to pay for its chipped tooth. My father couldn't bring himself to argue. You don't seem like a fine print kind of guy, Mr. Hurt. But you understand when I say, this looks bad. In reply, my father spoke the words he'd wanted to utter from the moment he'd first smelled smoke. I'm sorry. Salvatore sighed. Look, I'm going to get you and your pretty wife your check. He glanced at his watch and then brightened. This afternoon, in fact. Then he slapped the back of his palm against my father's chest and pressed it there. but there's something I need you to do for me first. It was brutally cold outside, but especially here, where Broadway and Columbus Avenue intersected. Even Lincoln Center's fountains, their jets almost furry in the January brightness, bent slightly in the prevailing wind, spraying unwitting passers-by. The spume steadily sheared off their apex like snow blown from a mountain's peak. Men held the brims of their hats, staggering as stiffly as zombies against the blast. Women pulled their scarves over their mouths, the trailing fabric snapping behind them as they leaned forward or sometimes even turned to walk backward against the gale. The only gustier expanse was Columbus Circle, a few blocks down, where the flurries seemed even more powerfully channeled by the GW building and then swirled before the Paramount Theater and the Coliseum's facade, whistling like some maritime squall. Shell would catch the one train there, take it to Grand Central, and then grab the queue downtown to meet Salvatore as planned, but only after he stopped at the bank. Get started now on your road to riches, my father had said in the commercial, by saving regularly at the dime. Offices in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Long Island. His tone was gentle, solid as the FDIC. As the bank's TV spokesperson, they'd given him a complimentary checking and savings account, and when he'd first started doing his business there, he couldn't help offhandedly mentioning to the tellers that he was the institution's spokesperson, just so they knew with whom they were dealing. "Mr. Hurt," said Glenda as he stepped to her window, "are you managing to stay warm out there?" "It's tough," my father said. "What can I do for you today? I need to make a withdrawal from my savings." Glenda slid him a slip and then folded her hands on the counter. "How much then?" If he hadn't been to the bank last week, he wouldn't have known his balance, just over $4,100. As a habit, he preferred to ignore it, thereby going longer stretches not tormented by its shabby state, or more recently, to be pleasantly surprised by the amount. Good money had been rolling in, the weekly checks from the Fisher King, as well as residuals from his network national ad for American Tourister, the one with the cage-bound gorilla giving hell to a piece of luggage. "Dear clumsy bellboys," he droned in the voiceover, "brutal cab drivers, careless doormen, ruthless porters, savage baggage masters, and all butter-fingered luggage handlers all over the world, have we got a suitcase for you?" There was an art to enlivening advertising copy, a jazz musician's sense of rhythm, of where to shorten a syllable or elongate a beat, the most important skill being where to touch down. And when he delivered the tagline, he supplied just the right injection of swagger, as if he, instead of the suitcase, oh, if only, were the one impervious to harm. "All of it," my father said. At this, Glenda winced. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hurt, but we ask you to maintain at least $100 balance. Otherwise, you have to pay a penalty." "4,000, my father said. He smiled wearily. "Keep the change." As a courtesy, Glenda laughed at his joke, but she was no fool. She knew that he was in trouble. She must be hyper-attuned to her patron's tells. This simple job, with its brief exchanges of hope and grief, destitution and largesse, yet even now my father couldn't help it. He briefly stepped out of the moment, committing his grim expression to memory. "File this away," he urged himself. "Save it for a performance." Salvatore had demanded they meet at the edge of Chinatown, on Canal and Bowery, the district's easternmost corner. It was a madhouse. Apron street vendors stood before their carts piled high with carrots and bok choy, loudly negotiating with customers. In the restaurant's windows hung rows of glazed piglets and ducks, their hooked bodies shiny and brown as if dipped in caramel. Here, pedestrian traffic changed, its density fivefold that of Midtown. All the micro-allowances to right-of-way were outright ignored by the Chinese. Their lack of concessions to flow created crowded eddies, so slow-moving Shell was forced to sometimes turn sideways, or at the worst bottlenecks, stand completely still. Salvatore had said he'd be in his car, that he would park in front of the Citizens Bank, and this seemed appropriate to my father, for in the shadow of its limestone dome, it was as if a robbery were about to take place. The insurance agent playing both thief and getaway driver. The very sight of the vehicle stopped Shell in his tracks. It was a black Lincoln Continental Mark III. Not so different in design from the model Anthony Quinn had driven in Europe, its hood similarly long and formidable, its front to rear fenders so tall and pronounced it reminded Shell of a catamaran. Seeing it, my father was suddenly seized by a memory. He and Lily were driving behind Quinn in a van. It had struggled to climb hills anyway, but loaded for bear with the movie star's painting supplies and knee-jerk rug and furniture purchases. It had become the little engine that couldn't. They had trailed Quinn's Lincoln all over Europe in this vehicle, from Naples to Rome to Perugia to Venice, from Milan to Biarritz and back, from Genoa along the Ligurian coast to Imperia. But now, most harrowingly, on their journey's final northward push through the Alps to Paris, they drove along the mountainous Col de Torini. Its hairpin so sharp it was like a carnival ride, Quinn's Lincoln disappearing behind walls of rock rising into their path, only to reappear far ahead, almost out of view, as if he were flaunting its handling in speed. I am not this man's voice coach, my father realized. I am his Sherpa. This trip would end with them rocketing through the guardrail to plunge into the valley, dying on this fool's errand called their honeymoon. What took you? Salvatore said when Shell got in the car. The insurance agent was eating from a takeout carton, exhibiting impressive facility with his chopsticks. When my father didn't answer, Salvatore tilted the top toward him. You want some? He asked. It's chop suey. My father shook his head. The windows were slightly fogged, but Shell could see the Manhattan Bridge's triumphal arch and colonnade ahead. From where they were parked, its span wasn't visible, nor Brooklyn's low-slung buildings, just sky. In New York, a rare view, like a gate to nowhere. The structure was reminiscent in its pillared horseshoe design of St. Peter's, and overwhelmed by memory yet again, Shell recalled Quinn and his mistress Yolanda standing beneath the Sistine Chapel's Pieta, the priest pouring holy water over their bastard child Francisco. Lily, kneeling on the pew next to Shell, had leaned toward him to whisper, "This is the most profane, ridiculous thing I've ever seen." Salvatore put down the carton. "We gonna do this?" he said. From his breast pocket, my father removed the bank envelope. Salvatore plucked the check and held the paper in the air between his index and middle finger. It was a larger slip than most, as if its additional surface area were necessary to accommodate such a figure. The amount typed in capitals, $10,000 and 0 cents. "I don't understand," my father said. "What?" "The math. You lost me," Salvatore said. "Of this," Shell continued, "this transaction." Salvatore smiled. "You wearing a mic or something?" "I give you 4 so that you'll give me 10. "Okay," Salvatore said. "Here we go. You give me 10, but it's really only 6. "Out," the agent said, reaching across to pull the door's latch. "If it's only 6, Dad said, and knocked his arm away. "Why not make it that to start?" "Don't fucking touch me. It doesn't make sense," my father said. "Get out of my car. It doesn't make sense." There followed an exchange. The two men grabbed each other's collars, but the stiff-armed fashion in which they clasped made it appear closer to a pose, this odd embrace like some foreign country's formal greeting. The pair pressed as far from each other, deadlocked, as possible. Still, the parting did finally come, albeit suddenly and more violently than Shell was prepared, for he was ejected from the car, stumbling backwards, while Salvatore peeled off in a great screech of smoke. This soon cleared to reveal the check, wadded in my father's palm, the slip crumpled there, but intact, and his money gone. The fire was no tragedy, as I had said, though because of it, I suffered a trauma. It occurred the following Sunday. By then, Mom had found us a place uptown on 88th and West End Avenue. This new apartment, so much larger than its predecessor, Orrin and I no longer needed to share a room. We were meagerly packed and ready to move from Alan Neal's the next day, but when my father appeared at the door, I knew somehow he'd come for me alone. I ran, hiding beneath the bed, but my father dragged me by my wrist from its safety. I vividly remember backpedaling with all the strength I had, grabbing a doorknob, a chair, a table's leg. I was as willing to pull my arm from its socket as a lizard to jettison its pinned tail. But it was no use. Exhausted, gone limp, my father gathered me into his arms and carried me down the hallway to our decimated apartment. The keyhole had been knocked out from it, and from its circle sprung pink insulation flecked with soot. He touched the door, and it swung inward easily to reveal the floor was still covered with water. This standing lake was black, ash and debris flecked, its surreal incongruousness straight out of a nightmare. I was afraid that its ink surface had fall-offs, sharp objects, that Dad might deposit me in it and leave me there. My father walked me through every room. He pointed out the charcoal streaks, climbing to sharp points where flames had licked the walls, the melted fixtures and torched mattresses, our blackened clothes. Though most terrifying by far was the stench. This cold mustiness, like the carcass of a drowned dragon. Having come full circle, having finally returned to the front door, my father stopped so that I might take a final look. When he was satisfied the image was indelible, he broke his silence. "Never again," he said to me. 3 years later, I made my first television appearance. Thanks. Yeah, I'll happily take questions about anything. Fire away. Don't be shy.
I thought I might start with a
Yes.
question that we've been talking a lot about in the senior creative writing class, which is about, well, I guess the focus of developing work in the class, but also developing writing practices that people can carry out beyond assignments, and just what your own daily, weekly, hourly, what are your writing, like where does the writing come from, where do you do it, how do you do it, what practices do you follow?
Daily, my practice, I'm a very early riser, like 4 or 5 in the morning, generally speaking. And I write, when I was a full-time writer, I'd write for 3 to 4 hours in the morning, do some form of exercise, decompress, eat, drink some coffee, do another about 2-hour session, and then lather, rinse, repeat the next day. I mean, by then you need to get out of your own head and cook dinner for the kids, et cetera, and try to, howl at the moon a little. Try to read in the evenings, and then, but always try to end on a kind of starting place where you feel like you were kind of cooking with gas, so that the next day you're sort of excited to get back to the work, get back to the page. Now at the review, it tends to be more one session where I work for 3 to 4 hours in the morning, and then I put on a different hat.
The literary life, about, yeah.
Go ahead.
Just to follow up on that, I'm curious about, since you've had a short story collection and a novel, you're a novel writer as well, did you use this exactly the same, where you're writing every day for that amount with the short stories?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the hell of my own personal process is I don't write in order. I don't write my stories in order or my novels in order. So for instance, I've got a lot of part 3 written. I've come to discover this was very much like Nabokov's process. I don't know how much you know about Vladimir Nabokov, but Vladimir Nabokov would write with index cards, and what he would do is he would write a scene that he thought sort of took place in the middle of his book, and he'd write the scene, and then place it in the middle of the shoebox, and then write something he thought took place at the end of the book and put it at the end, and then something at the beginning, and so on, until he had a shoebox full. Lolita took him about 6 years, had a shoebox full of index cards, and then he would remove the index cards and write the ligature, like write straight through the novel, creating the ligature between these various sections. So when I was writing Mr. Peanut and Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Peanut has a very complex structure, and so I would take breaks to write what I was like, like this is just, I just need to write, I need to finish something. Dang it, like I need to finish something. And then of course the same process would occur with the short stories. So I'd like write a part of the short story that really inspired me, and then I had like 20 incomplete things, which was, which made my wife pull her hair out. I was like, I swear they're coming. So do this, do that. So my process is really to again write from points of inspiration, and so what tends to happen, generally speaking, in terms of the overall arc of it is the beginning. I start with a great burst. Like I wrote the first 3 chapters of Mr. Peanut in a single sitting, and then the middle takes forever, and then there's this like streak period toward the end where I kind of know exactly what I'm doing, and as I'm writing can like sort of echo with certain ironies I know are operating at that point in the novel or in the short story. Yes?
So when you pick up a book to read just for fun, what do you go to?
Yeah, so reading for fun is not in my experience anymore. That ended a long time ago. And by that, I mean, that sounds dreadful. That's not, I don't mean that exactly. What I mean is that I'm always reverse engineering books. So when I come across something that I really like, I'm like, how did that person do that? And so I start to take it apart. The first books that really got me reading were Frank Herbert's Dune series, and also the Odyssey of Homer. So there was a period of time there where I read the Odyssey once a year for 10 years because it just kind of like got me back to just reading for reading's sake. But at the same time, when I was your age, I went through a really heavy Joseph Conrad phase where I was just reading and rereading and taking apart Joseph Conrad, and in ways that were kind of quasi unhealthy. Joseph Conrad, Walker Percy, Saul Bellow, and just seeing like how did that happen with no goal in sight. I mean, it's when I look back at that time, when I look back at when I was your age, it was kind of like pure play. I mean, I had this self-conscious idea of myself as a writer, but I was doing all sorts of odd jobs in Manhattan and just spending these hours in the morning just writing stuff, making up stuff, inventing stuff, and then reading like crazy at night.
I can't help but ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Does something come to mind when you think like a moment of figuring something out about the structure, say, of a Conrad novel or story, like, oh, that?
Well, something. I mean, I will tell you that in the current process with Playworld, I mean, you all may have noticed a lot of animal imagery throughout, but I mean, there's constant aquatic imagery in Playworld, which I wasn't aware of when I was starting. Mm-hmm. And so starting to use that aquatic imagery with intentionality became something that started to change as the years went on. Griffin being in that, there's that, one of the images that I'm always thinking about when I'm writing this book is, the famous, the three fit, the big, and where Griffin is on that food chain with the various adults. in the novel because it's a novel about, it's really a novel about the 80s, and it's a novel about a very different era of parenting where our parents had like no idea what we were doing, and we were given tremendous freedom, but we constantly, we would smash up against the adult world in ways that were pretty like violent and intense, especially for me as a child actor, where I was like the only kid on set with adults who would tell me things that I had no real context or way of understanding and processing. My favorite story about being a child actor is I did TV shows and movies when I was a kid, and I would be on set with some adult actor. We shot this one TV show I did at the same place with the original Saturday Night Live cast, 8H Studios at 30 Rock, and I'd be with some crazy adult who would talk to me for an hour and just tell me stories about his or her life that wouldn't ask me a single question. And at the end of just like monologuing for an hour, be like, God, Adam, you are the most interesting kid I have ever met. So perceptive, Jesus, love talking to you, God. So I was just like absorbing this stuff, being like, wow, yeah. Yes?
Where do you get like inspiration after writing, like in your personal life? Or is it
So when I was 4 years old, I burned down my parents' apartment. Very much like you heard. However, of course, if you notice, the Griffin takes the point of view of his parents. In that way, I mean, the obvious irony is that this is a Künstlerroman. It's like, it's really about how this kid becomes a writer, right? Between the bread of a Bildungsroman. But my parents had told me this story about how they got fleeced by this insurance salesman. And what did my dad tell me? My dad told me, yeah, like when we got to get that $10,000 check, I needed to go meet him in Chinatown and pay him a kickback. That's the story he told me, right? He didn't tell me what he looked like. He didn't tell me about the milieu. He didn't tell me about where they met. And that's your task as a writer, right? Everyone's had things that have happened to them, but whether or not they work on the page is a completely different challenge, right? And then you plug in the thematic matrix of whatever you're working on, and so in this particular case, in this particular chapter, I got my idea from a life event, but the technical challenge was how to tell that story and give it life, right? And so, and other stories I've heard over the years are the stories of this crazy, my parents went on their honeymoon with Anthony Quinn, right? My dad was Anthony Quinn's voice coach, the famous actor. If you don't know Anthony Quinn, go watch Zorro. I mean, not Zorro, Zorba. The Guns of Navarone, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? Huge movie star. And, my parents told me about this crazy honeymoon they spent just kind of like following him around, where my dad was supposed to be his voice coach, but they never sang together. They never did anything. Quinn was like, I'm going to get you in movies, Howard. And he never did anything. He just wanted a playmate. And my mom got just left behind doing dictation. And so that moment where she realizes she feels alone in her marriage, I mean, it's, I think a lot of people early in their marriage have one moment like that, where suddenly they're like, wait a second, like, not to beat a cliche, but the honeymoon's over, you know what I mean? And so, again, how to tell that story. And so that's always the challenge. And what does it involve? It involves invention. It involves hanging a left from autobiography into areas you know nothing about and making shit up. Making shit up.
I felt a left turn when you enter the scene, you think you're in the mind of the 6-year-old.
Yes.
And then suddenly the mind of the 6-year-old opens up into this whole other world involving many other consciousnesses and adult consciousnesses that there's no way for the mind of the 6-year-old to contain. And I wonder whether that decision came to you as a deliberate choice, or whether it happened in process and you said, whoa, is this okay? And then decided to go with it?
That is a fantastic question, because yes to all of the above. So let me explain. So the initial setup, if you think of it as like a wrestling feint, is that like you're telling the story about this particular thing, and then from a limited point of view, and then boom, you make that move. Any careful reader has to be like, wait a second. It is impossible that a 6-year-old would have this level of attunement, let alone, it's an impossible move. So the reader now, this is you'll hear about, we'll talk about this with Lincoln and the Bardo tomorrow, but a novel teaches the reader how to read it, right? Which is that you have a narrator who can occasionally, it only happens at several points in the book, can go into other consciousnesses. And so that sets up your understanding later in the book as to how he became who he became as a writer. So yeah, I mean, you want the reader asking that question.
I guess to piggyback on that, I felt the same way about that with Mr. Peanut, that, you know, I got to a point where I realized, I don't know whose point of view this is consistently coming from. I don't know if there's an omniscient narrator. I felt like I was changing between the characters, and I wonder how much was that planful and how much of that happened organically?
A lot of it happens organically, and then a lot of it becomes a consistent violation of that rule, which then makes you ask certain questions about why is the book doing what it's doing. You know, in the idea has anyone had this experience where you're on a plane with a complete stranger and you find yourself completely opening up to the stranger, or vice versa, and they tell you a story that just blows your mind in terms of its vividness? It's not like you just sat next to Virginia Woolf, but they tell you something and you are transported. Now the question at that moment is that, whose point of view is that? Mm-hmm. The story, the tale, told between two people hovers between you like this thing. The person next across from you has his or her own idea of details, but at that point, whose point of view is it? And so my experience of narrative is sort of a regular experience of being overwhelmed by narrative and being overwhelmed by the tale, and then kind of recovering from that. It can destabilize the reader, but I actually find in life it kind of happens pretty often. And it can happen pretty often, for instance, let's say with siblings. For those of you who have a fraught relationship with a sibling, you can feel sometimes, like when you get in a fight with your sibling, that their version of you, you're in an agon with their version of you. And if you have a pretty brutal fight, you can find yourself fighting with that version where you reinterpret events according to this other self, right? Does everyone know what I'm talking about? You know what I mean? Like, and so the question's becoming for me like how to deploy that formally, technically. I mean, right now the point of view, I call that point of view first person omniscient. And the only other person I know who regularly uses first person omniscient is Jeff Eugenides in Middlesex. Right? Because how can Calliope know that stuff? Calliope can't know that stuff. Cal can't know that stuff. Yes?
I was thinking about a sort of version of this in relation to one detail that I enjoyed from the reading, so zeroing in for a minute.
Only one detail, oh God.
This is pretty standard for me.
No.
Glenda, the
Yeah.
teller, where understanding Glenda's sort of whole life or daily life
Mhm.
in a way, and that she has those kinds of subtle recognitions that are kind of like deeply moral in some
Yeah,
ways
yeah.
about the people that she encounters. And so it's odd to be getting that kind of perspective both on her life and her insight into others, and yet it's also extremely natural.
Mhm.
To, like, that you recognize that. Of course you see sort of back into a person's past and forward into like their ability to predict behaviors in others. So I really liked Glenda.
Thanks.
I hope she's the hero.
Well, actually, that scene is interesting because if you looked at the text there closely, it's actually Shell who is he's doing the same thing that Griffin does, which he is stepping into her. He's hyper empathizing with her, and seeing him and the situation from her perspective, and recognizing that she probably does at times not say things to people. And there's Shell also at that moment trying to hold on to his identity, feel how your face looks, remember it for later, because he's suffering, so he's so at sea,
We're sort of coming to the end of our allotted time, but I'm sure that you'll want to come now tomorrow and hear more from Adam. This was really fascinating. And I imagine there'll be a few moments of mingling if you had a burning
Sure.
question
Oh, yeah,
you wanted
yeah.
to come and ask that you didn't. Great, but thank you so much.